The Assyrian Empire was the largest the world had known for almost 1,500 years. It spanned from Babylonia in the east all the way to Lower Egypt in the west, a vast strip of land characterized by revolutions in technology and governance. However, this empire did not last forever. In 1612 BC, it had been taken over by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, who had not held power in the Near East since the Old Babylonian Empire during the time of Hammurabi. And the Babylonian Empire marked the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II, who was most famous for his siege of Jerusalem and destruction of the kingdom of Judah. Scripture cites disobedience to God's laws and prophetic warnings as the primary reasons for the ensuing fighting. With that, Nebuchadnezzar deported the Jewish people in what would be known as the Babylonian captivity. The Judaite revolts ended with a 30-month siege of Jerusalem. As a result, the Temple of Solomon, that had stood for almost 500 years, had been destroyed, along with most of Jerusalem. However, not long after the captivity, the Near East would be shaken up once again. The Persians fought their way through Neo-Babylonian Empire, ending the conflict at the Battle of Opis and engulfing the remnants of Babylon. The Persians let the Jewish people return to Judah, where they would begin a long process of rebuilding the kingdom they had lost. And one of the most important aspects of that kingdom was the temple. The Second Temple marked the beginning of a new period in Israelite history, and saw the emergence of three distinct sects in Judaism: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees were the most prestigious of the three. They were tasked with maintaining the temple in Jerusalem, and represented the state both domestically and internationally. The Sadducees also led the army, collected taxes, and many were part of the high priests and traced their ancestry to the first high priests. The Essenes were Jewish mystics. They had little power outside of their communities and mostly kept themselves separate. They prioritized religious purity and their dualistic worldview. Many in their sect believed the high priesthood was illegitimate, and as a result tended to distrust the interpretations of scripture given by the other sects, and the high priests, preferring their own. But when it came to influence over the lives of everyday people, the Pharisees were second to none. They were notable for their upholdance and devout following of Mosaic laws. They were devoted to preserving their interpretations of scripture and the adherence of the law. They could be best described as legalists, that is, giving more emphasis to the words of the law instead of the meaning. This legalism has since made Pharisee a semi-common colloquialism of any person who holds more to the words of the rules rather than their meaning. But make no mistake, the Pharisees were a real group who had real impact on the ancient world and the gospel. And we see throughout Jesus' ministry and eventual capture and death that the Pharisees largely acted as the antagonists of the gospels, whether that is through trying to trick Jesus with a hard question or rally for his crucifixion. And while usually when we discuss Christ, we discuss his miracles, wisdom, and interaction with the disciples, we neglect to see how he confronts his enemies. So let's take a closer look at Christ's interaction with the Pharisees and see how they impact the gospel narrative. First, I think in order to truly understand Christ's interaction with the Pharisees, we need to understand how he views them. And I think there is no better example than the story of the prodigal son. There once was a man who had two sons. The younger asked his father to give him a share of the estate which he owned, and so the father divided it between them. Not long after, the younger son set out to travel with the inheritance he had collected. There, he wasted the money he was given with debauchery and wild living. After spending every last cent, there was a mass famine, and the son became in desperate need. So, he went to work for a man feeding pigs in the field, longing to eat the scraps he fed them. Finally, the son understood his going astray, and said to himself, "Even my father's servants have plenty to eat, yet here I am starving. I must set out to return to my father and tell him, 'Father, how I have sinned against heaven and you. There is no way for me to be called a son once again. Make me like one of your servants.' So he left the field that he toiled in, and began his return to his father. But on the way he stumbled upon his father, who saw him and was filled with compassion. He embraced his son and gave him a kiss despite his rebellion. And while his son told him, 'I have sinned against you, I am not worthy to be called your son,' the father did not care. He called his servants to clothe him and prepare the fattened calf for a feast of celebration. However, when the older son of the man saw the celebration for his wayward brother, he became enraged. He told his father, "How could you give him all of this, a feast and a celebration, when I worked tirelessly for you without disobeying you and never received this?" However, his father told him, "My son, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be merry, for your brother was dead and now is alive. He was lost and is now found." Now, what I want to highlight from this story is not the error and mistakes of the younger son, but the older, because this parable is actually a story of two prodigal sons, the younger representing hedonism and the older legalism. And we can start to see some similarities between the Pharisees and the eldest son. For starters, both believe that they have maintained the wishes of their father, that they have followed all the rules and checked all the boxes. In the Pharisees' case, this means that they have attended worship services, kept to dietary restrictions, and have consistently done the sacrifices and rituals common to the time. But that has fueled an ego to see the younger brother, the hedonists and sinners, as second-class citizens, people unworthy of the treasures of heaven. This ego is the basis of many of the flaws in the Pharisees that Christ will later point out, but it also goes to show that how the Pharisees saw themselves in the context of the time they lived in. They are superior people who have kept the law and traditions of their fathers, so they must be favored by God, and in turn be rewarded with all the luxuries of first century living, as well as the treasures in store for them in heaven. This ties in beautifully to the story of Job from the Old Testament, another example from the Bible of how the Pharisees can be viewed. Job is a wealthy man who has everything you could want from life. A large family, lots of land and livestock. He is in good health and has well respected throughout his community. He even does everything right, prays and makes regular sacrifices, yet when everything is taken from him by the devil, his home, his health, his livestock, and even his family, he first acts very strangely. Job doesn't curse God or become upset. Rather, he condemns his existence at birth, wishing death to come upon him. His three friends come, and because they are legalists like Job, can only believe that Job must have done something to lose God's favor, something so bad that it has left him on the receiving end of some of the worst punishment ever received. Even though Job knows that he has not committed some grave sin, it doesn't matter. He still lost everything. And so Job's mask of piety and ego of being a good rule follower comes crumbling off. Job berates God through a series of monologues, saying that he is unjust and unfair, that he doesn't punish people that deserve it. But this worldview is destroyed, as we see when God finally confronts Job directly on the suffering and pain he has endured. God shows Job the complexity of the cosmos. Though everything is made so perfectly to all work together and seamlessly, God is showing Job that how insignificant in the grand view of the eyes of God he is. There is a focus on wisdom here in these verses. The wisdom of God comes from the fact that he is the creator and knows why everything is the way it is because he designed it that way. He knows the inner workings of the clock, every gear and switch, every lever and button that comes together and creates the material world. And this wisdom here shows that the human mind cannot comprehend the intricacies and complexities the world has to offer. And this relates to Job and the problem of suffering because we cannot comprehend the reasoning behind why good people suffer. And Job learns this, which is why he repents and admits he doesn't know the complexities of the universe, nor does he know why good people suffer. And with that, God restores to him everything that he lost and then some. To me, the key takeaway from this story is not just that we should obey God despite bad things that may happen, but rather that our fundamental understanding of God cannot be of a cosmic vending machine or an all-powerful genie. There is a question posed by Satan in the very beginning of the book of Job. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, is our obedience to laws and rules disinterested, out of the goodness of our hearts, or because we want something, or want to avoid punishment? And with this understanding, we can see why Christ believes so strongly that the Pharisees are hypocrites. They will tell you that they serve God dispassionately, that they do everything out of their own piety because they are good people. And this mentality is broken because Christ is able to see through their masks. He knows they believe that they will be rewarded for their works, as we all do, and that they do not dispassionately serve. This gives us a foundation to be able to understand Christ's interaction with the Pharisees throughout the gospel narrative. Matthew 6 shows Christ's first mentions of the Pharisees when Jesus uses the scribes and the Pharisees as an example of what not to do when giving the Sermon on the Mount. Christ claims that the Pharisees do good works in the eyes of the public for their admiration and to be seen as righteous. Christ repeats the phrase, "They have earned their reward," which again cements the ideas that the Pharisees see the world in a legalistic mindset, believing that their reward for good works should be the title of rabbi, the best seats in the synagogue, the respect and admiration of the people, and their influence over the masses. Whereas Christ tells his disciples, these rewards are nothing compared to what the real relationship with God can give you. He tells them instead to do good in secret, to pray alone and out of view, because prayer and good works are not meant for public gawking, but to connect with God on a deeper level. Again, tying back to Job, the Pharisees have the same issue that Job did. They believe that if they input good things, they get good results. But that is not the mentality that we should have towards God. Later in Matthew, we see a highlight reel of Jesus' miracles, healing all kinds of ailments and casting out demons. And while this is taking place, the Pharisees are a hesitant opposition. They do things like criticize Christ for eating with tax collectors and not observing fasting, or saying that Christ is casting out demons by the power of demons, trying to say that he's Satan. But their protests of Christ's miracles are mostly overshadowed by the wonder and amazement of the disciples at the works Christ is able to do. Throughout this part of the gospel, I see the Pharisees as almost like a cartoon villain, showing up to make a quick conflict and then leaving in a short period of time. Almost like Team Rocket making chaos and then blasting off again.
Looks like we're blasting off again!
But Jesus would have another direct conflict with the Pharisees again in Matthew 12, when he and his disciples are criticized by the Pharisee for collecting grain on the Sabbath. And he refutes them first by saying that David entered and ate the bread of the house of God, which was unlawful at the time. And Christ explains that because he is the Son of Man, he has dominion over the Sabbath. This trope changes when Christ later enters the temple, where there is a man with a withered hand, and the Pharisees attempt to set him up and accuse him of working on the Sabbath, when he is asked, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" To which Christ replies, quote, "If you have a sheep that falls into a pit, will you not lift it out? How much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." He then heals the hand of the man, and with that action, the Pharisees begin to conspire on how to destroy him. Again, we see the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Even though they present themselves as these altruistic and pious people, they would rather see a man suffer with a bum hand than for it to be healed, because they have so much hatred of Christ. This gives us a concrete example of their hypocrisy, because even if they already believed doing good on the Sabbath was acceptable, they would betray that understanding of the law in order to criticize Christ and accuse him of breaking the moral law. We see the later chapters of Matthew that Jesus goes from refuting the Pharisees to outright accusing them of being blatant hypocrites. For example, in Matthew 15, when the Pharisees complain that Jesus' disciples are eating without first washing their hands, as the law commands, Christ accuses the Pharisees of teaching false doctrine, insisting that it is not what enters the mouth that makes a person unclean, but what exits it. Christ later explains to the disciples by saying that the food will pass through the body. It will be cleaned and discarded, but what comes out of the body comes from the heart. And this is what is troubling, because from the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. And these things are what actually defile a person. This is later expanded on in what could be considered the biggest and most direct example of Christ's interaction with the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, we see Christ begin what is known as the 7 woes of the Pharisees, a direct condemnation of what Christ considers to be the worst and most egregious beliefs and actions of the Pharisees. 1. The Pharisees shut out the kingdom of heaven. They not only prevent themselves from entering, but others who they teach and influence. This is apparent through the Pharisees' understanding of grace. Because they hold to these legalistic beliefs, they mostly lack any real connection to God, and as a result, prevent themselves from entering heaven. 2. The Pharisees, in attempting to make converts, instead make worse and more legalistic followers of God, when in reality they are more followers of law. This means that the Pharisees, when trying to convert people do not actually convert people into Judaism, but instead convert people into the Pharisees' religion, one where the letter of the law trumps the message behind it. 3. Christ claims they are blind guides, highlighting the belief of the Pharisees that an oath on the altar of the temple is meaningless, but an oath on the gold of the temple is what has bearing. They fail to understand that it is not the gold that is sacred, but rather what made the gold sacred. It is not the gifts on the altar that are sacred, but it is the altar that made it sacred. And likewise, an oath is an oath, whether it is on gold, or the altar, or the temple. This shows the Pharisees' inclination towards the material world and the things within as more important than the spiritual. Number 4. The Pharisees are meticulous in their following of the minutiae of the law, and yet they neglect the most important aspects of it, things such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And we just saw an example of this in the case with the man with a withered hand. A merciful person would have championed the idea of doing good on the Sabbath, especially healing. But instead, we saw the spinelessness of the Pharisees and how they let their hatred guide their beliefs. 5. Christ then says that the Pharisees appear clean and righteous on the outside, but inside they are filthy, like a cup that has been polished on the exterior, but never actually cleaned. And he continues with this theme in number 6, where he gives another example, this time saying the Pharisees are like whitewashed tombs, the outside of which are pristine and beautiful, but on the inside contain death and rot. Both examples highlight the essence of the Pharisees. On the outside, and in the eyes of the public, they are righteous and devout, followers of God. They are pristine and beautiful and should be admired. But on the inside, how Christ sees them, they are hypocrites, manipulators, who do not actually hold the beliefs they tout. They do not serve God dispassionately, even though they desperately attempt to appear that way. And finally, he gives the largest charge towards the Pharisees when he tells them that despite claiming they are not like those who killed the prophets, they are doing the very same thing. This is a fairly obvious foreshadowing of the crucifixion, and this is also a very damning thing to say to them. In this period, the prophets were the foundation of Pharisaic beliefs, and yet Christ here is claiming that if they had lived in the time of the prophets, they would have been the ones who were throwing the stones at them. A condemnation of this magnitude truly shows that Christ is not a big fan of the Pharisees whatsoever, and we can see somewhat of a callback to the story of the prodigal son. In that story, the younger son, who found himself stuck in hedonism, at the end of the story is saved. However, the elder son, who was stuck in legalism, is never said to have repented. While the sinner was able to end up being with God, the legalist at the end was set astray by his jealousy. This shows up in the gospel where we see Jesus treating what we may consider bad people like his own children. Meanwhile, people who we may consider good people are treated with a much harsher scrutiny and deeper criticism. The Pharisees were sick of Jesus' blatant disregard for their authority and practices. These woes were the final nail in the coffin, and the Pharisees paid Judas, one of Christ's disciples, to betray him and bring him into custody of the Roman authority. Christ's trial and crucifixion marks a shift from theological disagreement and an exchange of harsh words to violence. Previous to this, there were countless examples of little tiffs between Christ and the Pharisees, such as when they tried to confront him about paying taxes, and he responded, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." But this was different. The Pharisees were actively trying to have Christ killed, and they were successful. Christ was flogged and crucified despite Pilate believing that he was innocent. And even after the resurrection and the empty tomb, the Pharisees still mostly did not believe in Christ. They instead insisted that the disciples hid the body. The Pharisees saw Christ as a threat to their power, their law, and tradition. They saw Christ as a false prophet, and they attempted to martyr him like a real prophet. And we know how well that went. The Pharisees are the best example of how, as a church, we can be so easily blinded by our own faith and fall so far from God despite believing that we are his most faithful followers. The Pharisees believed that they were doing the right thing by crucifying Christ. They believed that they were the good guys who were preserving the faith of their ancestors. So what happened to the Pharisees after Christ? Well, they continued to persecute Christians, helping to get Christianity outlawed in the Roman Empire. The Pharisees largely retained their power in Judah, even after the emergence of new Christian religion, but now they had to compete with both the other Jewish sects as well as the early Christians for attention of converts and the favor of the Romans. However, it is at this point where we start to see the emergence of a fourth sect within Judaism, the Zealots, who believed that their Messiah had come to free them from the tyranny of the Roman Empire. There are countless examples of messiahs leading the groups of zealots in their uprisings against the Romans, only to be slapped down and getting the remaining population in even worse conditions than before. Figures such as Judas of Galilee, Menahem ben Judah, Simon bar Giora, and countless more held a considerable amount of influence and convinced many of the zealots to follow them in warring with the Romans. This led to the Jewish-Roman wars, where the Pharisees found themselves divided. Many were opposed to the rebellion, believing that compromise with the Romans would ultimately be better for their survival. But others, influenced by the zealots, supported the rebellion and aided with its efforts. The Jewish-Roman wars were, in all honesty, unwinnable by the revolutionaries. Judea had been so splintered, with each sect of Judaism desperate for power, led to so much infighting that there was never a sustainable Jewish state even after the Romans suffered a defeat. While they were able to go toe-to-toe with Romans during direct conflict, they seriously underestimated the advantage a professional army with a noticeable man advantage had over a ragtag revolutionaries who were too busy fighting themselves to defend against unrelenting waves of Roman legions. And this led to the killing of almost 2 million Judeans, many of whom were slaughtered after the Romans recaptured Jerusalem, as well as other smaller towns and cities. Those who weren't killed were taken as slaves or prisoners. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple, marking an end to the Temple period in Jewish history, a time where we are still in today. The region was left shell-shocked after the massive losses, and many abandoned the faith while also abandoning the region. The Zealots were killed directly in battle with the Romans. The Essenes were likely killed or went into hiding, and the Sadducees, without a temple to preserve, were left useless. The only ones able to survive were the Pharisees. They were able to make the concessions necessary to remain in Judah, while many others departed the region, leading to the Jewish diaspora. The remaining Pharisees transitioned into rabbis. Their preservation of the faith had paid off, mainly due to the fact that they were the last to survive. However, without the temple, they had to adapt the religion into what is now modern Judaism. The Pharisees were a pivotal group in the history of Christianity and the world at large, and as such, their legacy and influence continues to impact the world today.